What if the most carefully controlled royal wedding in modern history was secretly recorded from the inside, while a private argument exploded behind closed doors, violating every NDA meant to bury it forever? Because that's the whisper now growing louder, sharper, more dangerous. The kind of whisper that doesn't just question a fairy tale, it tears it apart. And at the center of it all is Tom Bower hinting, never fully saying, but never denying either, that somewhere inside those palace walls, someone pressed record when they absolutely shouldn't have. Not a journalist, not an outsider, an insider.
You're absolutely right. I mean, what I discovered was, of course, that she was hunting for a man in England from 2013 onwards, when her marriage had crashed and she couldn't find anyone in Canada at the time. And she wanted wealth and she wanted fame. And she targeted, there's no doubt, she targeted Harry and found someone who was a childhood friend of his who could introduce them. And then on the days before they met at their blind meeting in a club in London, she researched Harry very carefully.
Someone who signed the silence, someone who knew the rules, and someone who may have broken them anyway. And suddenly, everything we thought we knew about that wedding begins to feel staged, rehearsed, almost too perfect to be real. Because behind that polished spectacle, the carriage, the smiles, the cameras, the global applause, there were already cracks forming. Tiny at first, barely visible, but cracks nonetheless. Even back then, there were murmurs about tension, about control, about a bride who didn't want to follow tradition and a system that didn't want to bend.
She researched Harry very carefully and knew exactly what buttons to press, that he would like Africa, was interested in animals, was interested in philanthropy. She's very tactile, she's very seductive, and she landed him on the first night, even on his own admission. He says, I realized on the first date, she was the one. And of course that's because she's also a great, in that sense, an actress. She knew exactly how to play.
But what if those murmurs weren't just rumors? What if they were echoes of something much louder that happened in private? The story now being hinted at is chilling in its simplicity. A disagreement, no, not just a disagreement, a confrontation. One that escalated, one that was never meant to leave the room, and yet somehow it may have been captured. Think about that. In a place where phones are monitored, where staff operate under layers of confidentiality, where NDAs aren't just documents but iron chains, someone allegedly recorded it. Why? Was it protection, insurance, or something more calculated? Because if this is true, then this wasn't just a moment of emotion, it was a moment someone believed would matter later. And that changes everything.
This particular saga at Sandringham, which obviously was told by someone who was there, was a decisive moment. I mean, it's the moment where effectively she says to Harry that you've got to dump all your friends. And none of those people at his shooting weekend were then invited to the dinner after the wedding. I mean, that was the crunch, that she separated him from his hinterland. And of course, he does suffer now enormously.
Because suddenly, those earlier reports about tensions during the wedding preparations start to feel less like gossip and more like foreshadowing. There were already signs, the clashes over details, the disagreements over protocol, the whispers of friction between personalities who refused to bend. And then there was the pressure, not just the pressure of a royal wedding, but the pressure of image, of narrative, of controlling how the story would be told. Because according to Bower's broader claims, this wasn't just a relationship, it was a carefully constructed ascent, a move, a strategy. And when strategy meets tradition, sparks don't just fly, they explode. Now imagine that explosion happening not in public, but in a private room surrounded by people who know exactly what's at stake. Imagine voices raised, decisions challenged, lines crossed, and someone quietly capturing it all, not intervening, not stopping it, just recording, because they knew this moment could become power. That's the part no one is saying out loud, but everyone is thinking. Because if a recording exists, it doesn't just expose a fight, it exposes truth, unfiltered, unedited, uncontrolled. And that is the one thing the royal machine has always feared most. Because everything about that wedding was designed to project unity, elegance, perfection, a modern fairy tale. But fairy tales don't have NDAs. Fairy tales don't have insiders risking everything to break silence. Fairy tales don't have hidden recordings. And yet, here we are. Now the question isn't whether tension existed, that's already been hinted at, even documented in fragments. The question is, what exactly exactly happened in that room? What was said that someone felt needed to be preserved? Because people don't secretly record calm conversations. They record moments that could change narratives, moments that could flip power, moments that could destroy reputations. And suddenly, the timeline becomes suspicious. Because not long after the wedding, the fractures became impossible to ignore. Distance from the family, strained relationships, a shift that felt too sudden to be random, as if something had already happened, something deeper, something irreversible. And what if that moment, the real turning point, was never public? What if it was that private confrontation, the one that may now exist, sitting somewhere unheard, unseen, but very real? And here's where it gets even darker, because if an insider truly recorded it, that means they kept it. And if they kept it, then they had a reason. Was it leverage, protection, or was it always meant to surface at the right time? Because timing in stories like this is never accidental. And Tom Bauer, he doesn't just throw hints into the air without purpose. He circles, he builds, he lets the tension grow until the question becomes unavoidable. And right now, the question is screaming. Who recorded that moment and why? Because if that recording ever sees daylight, the wedding we all watched may not be the real story at all. And here's where the silence starts to feel louder than any confession. Because the deeper you go into this alleged recording, the more it stops looking like a random act and starts feeling like something far more deliberate. Almost as if someone inside that tightly controlled world knew, long before the public ever did, that this perfect royal moment was sitting on a fault line ready to split open. Because think about it carefully, slowly, like someone retracing steps after a crime scene has already been cleaned. Who exactly had the access, the proximity, and the nerve to do this? Not just anyone walks into those private wedding preparation rooms, not just anyone stands close enough to witness tension unfold in real time, and certainly not just anyone would dare to risk everything, career, reputation, legal consequences, by pressing record when every rule screamed don't. This wasn't reckless. This was intentional. And the more you follow that thread, the more unsettling it becomes, because it suggests that whoever did this wasn't just reacting in the moment, they were anticipating it. They were expecting something volatile enough, explosive enough, that capturing it would be worth the risk. Now pause on that, because that single detail flips the entire narrative. It means the tension wasn't unexpected. It wasn't a surprise argument that spiraled out of control. It may have been building, simmering, escalating behind the scenes while the world was busy obsessing over dresses, guest lists, and fairy tale headlines. And those earlier whispers about clashes, about control, about friction, about personalities refusing to bend, suddenly stop feeling like isolated incidents and start aligning into a pattern that was visible to insiders long before it ever leaked out. And if insiders saw it coming, then what else did they see? Because recordings don't exist in isolation. They come from environments where people are watching, listening, observing quietly, picking up on shifts that outsiders would never catch. The tone of a voice, the way a conversation changes when certain names are mentioned, the tension that lingers even after the room goes silent. All of that builds context. All of that creates motive. And suddenly, this alleged recording doesn't just feel like a captured moment, it feels like evidence from a much larger story that was unfolding in real time, hidden behind carefully managed appearances. Because let's not forget what was happening outside those walls. The world was being sold a narrative of unity, of modern love reshaping tradition, of a couple stepping into history with confidence and grace. Every image, every headline, every official statement reinforced that idea so strongly that questioning it almost felt absurd. But inside, if these whispers hold even a fraction of truth, there may have been a completely different atmosphere. One where expectations collided with reality, where control became a battleground, where decisions weren't just about a wedding, but about identity, power, and the direction of an entire future. And that's where the idea of a private fight stops sounding small. Because this wasn't just any couple. This was a moment carrying the weight of a monarchy, a legacy, a global audience watching every move. So if something fractured behind the scenes, it wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. And that's exactly the kind of moment someone might want to capture, not out of curiosity, but out of understanding that this wasn't just a disagreement, it was a turning point. Now ask yourself this: if such a recording exists, why hasn't it surfaced yet? Because in today's world, secrets don't stay buried easily. Files leak, audio appears, anonymous sources emerge, and yet this, if real, remains in the shadows, which leads to an even more more unsettling possibility, that it's being held back on purpose, because information like that isn't just explosive, it's strategic. Release it too early and it gets dismissed. Release it too late and it loses relevance. But release it at the exact right moment and it can reshape everything. And suddenly you start to see why someone might keep it hidden, because timing in stories like this is power. And if you follow the timeline again, the growing distance after the wedding, the fractures becoming public, the narrative slowly shifting from fairy tale to something far more complicated, you begin to wonder if that moment, that alleged recording, was the first domino, the moment when everything changed, even if no one outside ever saw it. Because from that point forward, the trajectory felt different, less aligned, more strained, as if something had already broken quietly behind the scenes. And Tom Bower's hint, it doesn't confirm, it doesn't reveal outright, but it plants the idea in a way that refuses to go away. It lingers, like a question that keeps circling back no matter how many times you try to ignore it. What really happened in that room? What was said that someone decided needed to be preserved forever? And more importantly, who is still holding on to it? Because if there's one thing history has shown, it's that recordings have a way of resurfacing when they matter most, when the narrative is fragile, when the stakes are high, when the truth, or at least a version of it, can no longer be contained. And if that day ever comes, if that audio, real or rumored, ever breaks through the silence, then the world won't just be revisiting a wedding, it will be reinterpreting it. Every smile, every glance, every moment replayed under a completely different light, because suddenly the question won't be whether the fairy tale was real. The question will be whether it ever existed at all. And that's the part that makes this rumor so dangerous. Not because of what it proves, but because of what it makes people doubt. Because once doubt enters the story, it doesn't leave. It grows, it spreads, and it changes everything.